settle or find a solution to a problem or a matter. Resolute. Well, that's purposeful or determined or unwavering. Resolution. Well, then that kind of looking at those last two and coming to the definition of resolution, firm decision to do or not do something. This is a time of year where a lot of people, if not us, why a lot of people around us make what? New Year's resolutions. And I know sometimes we talk about this, and sometimes I don't mention it at all when it comes to this time of year. But thinking along those lines, I mean, looking at the statistics, and I don't know where they get all of these. You know, you can take polls and you can kind of make those say what you want to say, but I don't think anybody would do that with this, surely. But and what I found was that out of the Americans who make New Year's resolutions, 55% keep that resolution for 1 month. And when I started adding these up, it was like, no, this doesn't add up. But out of that, I mean, just going from there then, and that same number, in 6 months, there's 40% of people who have kept them. And then by the time it gets down to the year, it's 19% have kept the resolutions. That's not real good, is it? I mean, a little bit less than a fifth there of the people. So 1 in 5, we might say, you know, keep their New Year's resolution. And so if we went around the room and we picked out 5 that were making New Year's resolutions, just one of those people might keep that New Year's resolution. Well, I want us to look in Scripture and see, I mean, what is it about us making decisions in our life and things that would maybe that in some way they affect us, and so we make the decision, or we realize that our lives affect other people, so we make a decision, because some of them can be that. And who are we to say to each other, well, that's not good, you shouldn't make resolutions. But let's look into Scripture and see if there's any precedent, see if there's anything that would address that. So if you will, turn back to Daniel, the book of Daniel. And I picked a couple of passages because of the wordings that are used there. And we're going to start in verse 1 of chapter 1 of Daniel. I'm not going to read the whole thing, of course, but I just want us to see some of what happened during this situation. So we'll read chapter 1, pretty much the whole chapter, so we get the picture of what was going on. Now, as we'll see here, God allowed Judah to be overthrown in Jerusalem, and Nebuchadnezzar, being the king of Babylon, I mean, he was leading that, of course, and this was within the will of God. It was something that was prophesied that was going to happen to, as we see them, God's chosen people, because they needed it, because God was even preserving them through this for what he was going to do later on. So beginning in verse 1 of Daniel chapter 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. He was going to make Babylonians out of these men. I mean, take these young guys, they're good-looking young men, they're intelligent, they can reason, and start teaching them. And as you train them over these 3 years, we're going to feed them well, too. We're going to take food from the king's table, and we're going to give to them. The food from the king's table, that would have been the best food that there was. And so we're going to take good care of them. We're going to wine and dine them up as we teach them to make them Babylonians. He wanted the wise people. He wanted the people. He was going to utilize them. Among these, in verse 6, among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. It's kind of funny. You know Daniel's name, and usually don't refer to him as Belteshazzar, even though, I mean, we can read that in there. But it's interesting, we remember the given names from Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, more than we remember their given names. And so, as we see these are all involved with this, and these are the ones that are listed that are set apart. It said in verse 8 then, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. All right, so we see that Daniel resolved to do something. He was making a resolution, if you will. He was saying, I'm not going to do this. I am not going to defile myself with this. I mean, if you want me to serve, I will serve, but who I'm really serving is God. And so I'm not going to defile myself with this. I'm not going to live better. And even thinking about those who were still left in Judah. I mean, they took a lot of people. Not everybody was taken. There were some that were left, and they lived poorly. And thinking about possibly even his countrymen, maybe his family, others that would not have been treated well, like these who were considered the elite. And so they were separated out as the elite, but Daniel said, no, I'm not going to do that. And so he made a decision, but he was giving that decision to who? To God. He was making that decision before God, and he was recognizing God in all of this. Now, as we look into other scriptures, I want us to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, there's another instance in which the word is used, or at least in the NIV, the New International Version. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, we're just going to read 5 verses here. He says, this is Paul writing the Corinthians, and he's already introduced some things that are wrong, some things that are going on within Corinth that are going to have to be corrected, and he's going to introduce a lot more. That's what 1 Corinthians is really about, is about correcting the Corinthians on things that they've gotten wrong. He does a little bit of encouraging through here, but most of it is having to correct them. And this wasn't being mean. There was a lot of things they misunderstood. There was a lot of things not only they misunderstood, but in their application into their lives on how they could live one way and say things another way, and what was pleasing to God and what wasn't pleasing to God, they needed to understand. So he's writing this letter to them, and he says in chapter 2, verse 1, when I came to you, brothers, I did not come with eloquence or superior wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. He's saying, I didn't come as somebody who could persuade you because I could talk extremely well, because I could be charismatic and fascinating when I would speak so that you would listen to me and I would be able to convince you. No, I didn't come that way. He says, for I resolved, verse 2, for I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I came to you in weakness and fear and with much trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on men's wisdom, but on God's power. Now he's saying this because they've kind of reverted back a little bit. They are kind of relying on men's wisdom. They are kind of relying on what others have persuaded them to follow. And this unfolds within the rest of the letter. But here he's saying, I didn't come to you that way, but I made a resolve that all that was important was Jesus Christ and Him crucified. If we can keep that central, Corinthians, if you just remember Jesus Christ and Him crucified, everything else will line up. Because that is the importance of your salvation. So you remember Jesus Christ and Him crucified. What do you remember with all that? You remember the fact that Jesus served. And He came here to serve. And He said He was coming here to serve. You remember the stories about Him draping the towel around His own waist and getting down and washing the disciples' feet. But He was talking about something greater that He was going to be doing the next day, which was giving His life. He was going to serve. You remember Jesus Christ and Him crucified. You remember that without that, you can't have a relationship with God. I mean, all the things that you need to remember within your life, you remember Jesus Christ and Him crucified when you go to make a decision, and that will affect your decision. Paul said, I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And of course, we're not going to read the rest of the letter this morning, but all these applications go back to that. Maybe it is, as we determine that we're going to make a New Year's resolution, that we decide something that we want to change. So we decide that there's something that needs to be different within our lives, and so we're going to make that change. Well, let me challenge you that perhaps that's where it goes wrong. It is once people say, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to start it on January the 1st, and this is what I'm going to do with my life in whatever particular area. What's one of the ones that you think is probably the most common? Lose weight, okay. Or going to the gym. Are you going to lose weight? You're going to go to the gym, that kind of thing. And so we make a resolution that we're going to do that, and we rely on our decision, we rely on our power to do that thing. How long does our power last? Well, for 55% of people, it lasts for a month. For 40% of people, it lasts for 6 months. And for 19% of people, they can make it the year. Because doing things within our own power, I mean, we begin to realize very quickly our own weaknesses. How many have ever made New Year's resolutions and did not keep them? All right, the only people who didn't raise their hands are people who never made a New Year's resolution, right? So go to Romans chapter 12. Verse 1 is not my point, but it's one of my favorite verses, so I'm going to read verse 1 with verse 2 anyway. It says, therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Then he says, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. Let's read that verse over again. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. So we're not to be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world. The pattern of this world serves self. or at least serves something or someone other than God. I mean, that's what fits the pattern of this world, and particularly, especially even within our society, serving self. It's what we want, it's what we decide, it's where we want to go, what we want to do, and when we want it. And so it is conforming to the pattern that is around us, that we see everybody else living, and not being happy living. Not being fulfilled living. That there's something missing. They're still looking for something. There's always something new to try to get to make us feel better than we do. The pattern of this world. No more. But he says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Transformed by the renewing of your mind. Wouldn't you say that would tie in really close to a resolution? If you're resolved, maybe that's part of it. When we think of resolution, we think, oh, this is what I'm going to decide to do, and so I'm going to do it. But what does resolved mean? I mean, what did we look at resolved meaning? I mean, there is a firmness to a decision that is made. A resolution is a firm decision to do or not to do something. And so this firmness is there. You make it absolute. This is it. And so if we're going to decide something, he says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. If you're going to approach things differently, if you're going to do something differently than what you have done in the past, or stop doing something or start doing something, that we allow our mind to be renewed. And he says, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. His good, pleasing, and perfect will. So maybe the question we should be asking before we ever make a decision is, what does God want? Is this God's decision? Is this what God would have in my life? So whatever it is, and we could probably go across and name all kinds of resolutions that might be there that people pick, or maybe that you've already picked, and lay them out there and say, is this something that is going to serve God better than I did before? Is this something that is serving Him, or is this something that's serving me? Is this something that is going to make God feel good, or is this something that's going to make me feel good, or is it both? I mean, what does God want in your life? Then maybe approach it where we make a decision, that's what I'm going to do. Because then we have no longer made the decision ourselves. We've no longer taken upon ourselves the ability to decide what is best for our life. How do we do with that most of the time? When we decide what is best for our life, rather than letting God decide. I mean, we end up going wrong directions. We make spur of the moment decisions sometimes, and we end up going along with the pattern of the world. And it's so easy to do. We live in this world. We rub elbows with people all the time. We see other people experiencing things. And so sometimes we make these decisions based upon what we want, based upon what we think will make us feel better. But what does God want? And so the renewing of our mind is something that's going to come from Him, not from us. It's something that's going to come from His power, not from within us. He says in verse 3, for by the grace given to me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the measure of faith God has given you. And so when we recognize that it is God working within our lives, and if we accomplish something, if we're going to, if you didn't raise your hand earlier, and because every New Year's resolution you've made you have kept, I kind of made a joke about it, but it's possible you may have kept every one. It's very, very possible that you were relying on God to help you keep those, because it was decisions for Him. And so as we trust in Him, then even the accomplishment of it, I mean, that's not something that we want to even take credit for, but to give credit to Him. Not to think more highly of ourselves than we ought to think. If you have overcome something in the past, if God has helped you to start putting something into your life that wasn't there before, I mean, you want to give Him the credit, right? Not to think, okay, this is what I've done. This is the accomplishments that I've made. And a lot of times New Year's resolutions are kind of tied in with that, because we want to achieve this so we can look back and say, look what I did. And so what? It's about us rather than about Him. But if we know Jesus Christ and Him crucified, and that's what we focus on beyond and above anything else, then we're not going to be looking at self, because we know that self is part of what sent Him there to us. We know that self couldn't do anything without Him, couldn't accomplish without Him. There would be things, sure, on this earth we might do. There might be things that might impress people. There might be things that might change physical life here. My dad and I went to some cemeteries a couple of days ago looking for, would have been my great-great-grandfather's grave, that he wasn't sure where it was at because his father wasn't sure where it was at. So we were looking, and there's stones, and there's some of them that have names on them, because we're looking way back into the 1800s now, and you can see some of those, and you can look at it close enough, or at least long enough, to make out part of a name. But then there's also the stones that it's completely gone, because I mean, back in those days, there were some of the stones weren't even smooth when they would inscribe upon them the way that they would, and you can't make out anything, and some of them never did have anything on them, just a rock. And then there's some that it's just sunken in, and there's no marker there, but there's a grave there. What did those people do? What did they accomplish? How did they change other people? If they remember Jesus Christ and Him crucified, and that's what they base their decisions upon, I guarantee you they made a difference for eternity, because people were saved, because other people learned about Jesus Christ. It may not have been them just personally that maybe dunked them in the water. It may not have been them that personally said, I want to tell you about Jesus Christ. But collectively, as a body of believers in Jesus Christ, they being a part of that. And that's where Romans 12 heads, is from where we stopped reading, was everybody's given a part in this. So what you do it well. Do it for Him. And so making those resolutions, maybe we do need to think about what they are, and are there some we need to make? If you all want to come up here, you can. I'm going to read one more passage. And it may fit and it may not. I guess it would fit if we were going to use that one, losing weight or going to the gym, but I think it fits for so much more than that. And it's in 1 Timothy chapter 4, and it's said in verse 8, in this context of Timothy, you need to teach these people what is important. And he says this, he says, for physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come. Just as much as we can point to, physical exercise. I mean, things that we do, the things that we have, the daily activities that we're involved in, all of those things, yes, there's some profit. But godliness has profit not for just right now, but it has profit for this life, for the life to come. So You want to make some resolutions? Or maybe one? Maybe not look at the year. Maybe not a New Year's resolution. How about a new life resolution? If you need to respond to this, come as we stand and